Welcome back to The Full View. We're still coming to you live from the IEC Results Operation Center. Now, Parliament's business has come to an end officially and finally, unless, of course, an emergency of some sort happens between now and when officially the election results are declared. However, the sixth administration of Parliament was perhaps the single busiest administration of Parliament since the dawn of democracy. A lot of work took place administratively, given that Parliament had burned down at some point. There's been a change in parliamentary speaker, but also, importantly, a lot of legislative work has taken place in this administration. Just last week, over the last 3 weeks, for instance, President Cyril Ramaphosa had signed 8 new bills into law, with a few more on his table at the moment, such as the Energy Regulator Bill, right? Professor Susan Booysen, who's a political analyst from the Wits School of Governance, joins me for this conversation to unpack this more. Prof, I don't mean to be too reductive, but what out of 10 would you grade the sixth administration of Parliament?
Hey, so much was done, but so much was not done as well. I wouldn't rate them honestly much higher than 5 out of 10. Because the work was done, but there are so many gaps, especially in matters like accountability, holding the executive to account, its internal matters, how they work in Parliament, and unfinished legislation, and finished at the last minute. Much of it was not the fault of Parliament, the legislative in its own right, but also because of late submissions by the executive. There were many problems, but overall, yes, much more remains to be done, and the seventh Parliament's got their work cut out for them.
Yeah. How significant an event in the parliamentary lifespan was it that a speaker had to resign due to allegations of corruption and being officially charged for corruption? I can't recall any other administration within which there has been a change in the speaker.
No,
two changes, by the way.
Not in this way. No, especially for adverse reasons, if one can use a euphemism there, where she was really pushed to resign, forced to resign, and on top of that, other officials in Parliament other positions were also at stake. So it was not a grand performance there at all. A bit of a very inglorious end to this Parliament.
Yeah. Let's talk a little bit about that. The role of the Speaker is not an innocuous position. It shapes the culture of accountability, shapes the culture of administration and lawmaking. And that's because the Speaker has a very important role to play when it comes to things like holding committee and committee work to a strict calendar and to account. When you compare Thandi Modise, who was the Speaker prior to this, a cabinet reshuffle happened. Thandi Modise was then removed as Speaker, and then Nosiviwe Mapisa-Nqakula became the Speaker in that cabinet reshuffle, and then she had resigned. Now there's a third Speaker in Parliament. Have you seen a rhythmic change in that cultural aspect of parliamentary work?
I think it was really very disruptive and demoralizing an event in the life of Parliament, because the Speaker is a person who simply has to be held in high esteem, has to give leadership also on ethical, procedural matters to all of Parliament there, and that authority of that person needs to be beyond reproach. And she obviously had to step down because she didn't fulfill any of those criteria anymore. And that is very invasive, disruptive, disheartening development in Parliament's life.
Yeah, the first 3 years of Parliament, the first 2 years of Parliament were spent trying to make sense of COVID-19. A lot of committee work went into accountability of PPE tenders and how COVID regulations were structured. Do you think Parliament did well? South Africa is often praised for how it's handled COVID-19 pandemic, both from a lawmaking and a regulatory perspective, but also from an overcoming perspective. How much of a role did Parliament play in that?
No, Parliament remained standing and continued through the motions, also the lockdown period, and it went through the motions of doing the work it has to do. But I thought it was often quite uninspired and water treading rather than definitive pace-setting work like South Africa needs in a time of severe socioeconomic crisis and so on. And so Parliament remained standing there, but in as much as the executive took much of the initiative in that period, much of the functions were delegated also by Cyril Ramaphosa as president, Nkosazana Dlamini-Zuma as minister in the presidency, responsible for those types of matters. There was a lot of passing of the responsibility into the executive, and the executive really taking over much of the work that would in normal circumstances have been...
Would Parliament have been more proactive there?
If Parliament had been more proactive, I really think they could have been, and that would have been part of the overall issue with Parliament at this stage. One of the big criticisms, also in terms of insufficient implementation, attention to, consideration of, the Zondo Commission's requirements, and it having implored and really given an instruction to Parliament to do more to hold the executive to account.
Yeah.
And so it is in that genre that these deficits also fall.
Yeah, we saw Parliament do a lot of accountability work, especially the committee. When it came to ESCOM, you saw the executive of ESCOM appearing before that committee a lot more often than in previous years. And we've seen some of the functional changes of ESCOM change. Did Parliament do well in that regard?
I think Parliament tried in some ways, and that is one of the examples, a handful of them, that are being cited for Parliament having extracted more accountability also from the Minister of Higher Education, for example, forcing him to bring a report to Parliament, from Minister of Public Enterprises to bring more accountability and transparency on matters of SAA deals, for example. So we saw a few cases where they did impressive work. That type of work in the next term can be followed through and be brought to
just the last one on that, because what overlaps into the next term is still the Zondo Commission of Inquiry report that was released in the 6th administration parliamentary term. President Ramaphosa gave his report back to Parliament on what they were doing and what they were planning on doing to implement the recommendation of the report. But we haven't heard much coming out of Parliament in terms of holding the executive to account on that timeline, on the commission report. That commission report still exists and lives in the next administration.
Absolutely. Now, that is probably a problem of a Parliament which has a strong, with the biggest party, majority party, has a strong majority, and the MPs can take all decisions by straightforward majority vote. And so that's going to be a fascinating period in the next seventh life of Parliament, if there is indeed a coalition government.
If there is a coalition government, do you imagine the legislative work of Parliament being hamstrung?
Some parties would consider it as becoming hamstrung, yes, but I think creatively and in the interest of the South African citizenry in general, there is more accountability, more joint decision making, more unity of action, which will be forced to get to, if there is a coalition government. That could actually bring about a lot of good.
Yeah, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you so much, Prof Booysen. Really do appreciate your time and your insights. For more on this, we are going to be crossing live over later on this. We're going to be crossing live over to the Union Buildings, where the SABC News political editor, Mzwanele Mbeche, will be standing by to give us an update on President Ramaphosa's scheduled address at 6 p.m.